Hello, everyone. Welcome to this next podcast, Raw and Real, on the topic of I don't actually know. I know what I'm going to talk about, but I didn't think about the topic. The topic is being unsupported and feeling unsupported. That's the topic. And the reason why I chose this is because it's actually really central, for me at least, and I see for many people underlying many of their life experience, this deep wound of feeling lack of support in life, right, is really big. And it has many angles and it comes from a number of things. And I want to discuss those here on Raw and Real because it's what I see and what isn't fully being addressed, and it isn't fully being healed either, for that matter. And I've been on my own long journey with this wound, and I just wanted to take some time to really bring that to you in a way that may help you as well understand better what's going on and find ways of support to help you through this type of wound if you have it. Because let's dive in here. This wound of the pain of not being supported that you may experience manifests in the way that I'm framing it now, right, as you being in a place where you may not experience the right level of support that you can depend on, and especially not in the moments when it may really matter, when things get really shitty, shit hits the fan in your life, in your states of mind, in your environmental circumstances, your life circumstances, etc. You may really need support. And what I've noticed for myself, what happens kind of flawlessly in that moment, is people react in a way where I actually get left on my own. Despite promises, expectations, beliefs, shared agreements, doesn't really matter. And it brings me to a place where I feel, if I were to describe this to you from my own deep inner self here, it brings me to a place of feeling this deep abandonment wound. And from that wound, you can imagine, right, it triggers the feeling of being unseen, to not being seen. And everything around what I experience in my life generally kind of comes back to that core. And it's kind of interesting because I used to believe that that requires other people to see me more in that place to heal. And it's all very nuanced, right? Because it's not that that's not true, but it's, you have to put the right needs in the right place, like a puzzle. And it's partially true because we're social beings and we grow and we flourish through interconnectedness with each other and the right level of nurturing and support. Right? That's why babies crave touch and love and affection, sometimes according to studies even more than food, because it is a more vital need that they have, right? That's the basis of our humanity. And this may go as far as it did for me, which is touch on the deep fear of survival. Because if your life depends on that support as part of struggles that you don't know how to resolve or you don't know how to get out of, it becomes even more stressful, straining, and important to be seen and supported in wherever you're at, right? And this is one of the biggest wounds that is suppressed not shared, not talked about, not revealed because it's so vulnerable and it has so much feeling level charge in it as a wound, right? That I see also in women. And the reason why I see it a lot in women is because, and I've helped women with this too, is because it often comes, to be honest, in my opinion right now, stating that, and my experience, it does often come through the male presence that wasn't there in a time when that was really important or critical, maybe at a younger age. Or, for example, a parental figure like a father was there, physically present in the times that it was needed, but emotionally absent. So at a deeper level, not really there. And that can quickly get dismissed, and then it can become neglect, and it can become ignored and then suppressed. And then nobody talks about it, but it lives out as an alive, energetic state that attracts more of what you don't want in your life. And you experience this deeper level of abandonment and letdown, and then the disappointments, and then that can fester, as it did with me, into defensiveness, resentfulness, bitterness towards people. Yeah, it can get really out of hand, right? Sharp around the edges, being intolerant, becoming, for women, bitchy maybe, but it can become, depending on your persona and your unique vulnerabilities and weaknesses, if you will, you can turn into all kinds of things from this wound, right? So let's just take a moment now, because that's the part I want to introduce a little bit more into these podcasts, is taking a moment, just taking a breath and taking in some love for that if you're going through that, because that's what you deserve, that's what you really do deserve. And that's also what I stand for. To bring through, as I share on these podcasts, as I shared in the description of these podcasts as well, that I want to practice more, because I've been lacking in that department, I think, to bring through more vulnerability, more realness, more open-heartedness, more compassion, because that's the thing I need more of for myself and to bring to others as well. Right? So, yeah, so continuing here on that piece, and that's a lot, by the way. See, for me, this is, I have to slow down, because for me, this is, I go through it really fast, but it has an emotional charge to it that I want to slow down so that I keep you engaged as I share about these places, these deeper places that are going on, because I'm very good with analyzing the situation, but I also need a practice for myself being very considerate of what's going on for others as they go through this process where I'm sharing something like these very deep topics here that are critical for your path, if your path is to spiritually and emotionally and mentally and psychologically grow, right? Grow, awaken, heal. And so with this abandonment wound, something that, as a next step to this, I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into this pain. To me, it often has to do with a father figure or a male presence that doesn't live up to their promises, agreements, expectations. And I don't really have the right word, but what I'm talking about here when I say expectations and promises and agreements is I'm talking in a broader sense, that there's accountability for their actions. This is something that the male or the masculine side of us really needs to hear, because they like to escape and avoid that. That's why this, a part of the reason why this society is so fucked up, is because people lose their reference points of morality and duty and sense of obligation, but in a positive way, in a kind of in a healthy way, competitiveness, but also more having a higher quality standard and moral fiber. We're losing that rapidly as a society. And so what I'm talking about when I say accountability for their actions, I mean, for example, really specifically, if you have a baby, that you take care of that child and everything that involves raising that child. If you're responsible for that action of birthing a child, or not literally because that happens through a woman, but I mean, if you're the male presence in this regard, that you actually stick to, now you have a responsibility in life. And I see very often that doesn't happen. Those responsibilities don't get met. But it goes further than that. It goes into, well, if you're a father figure, you do everything you can to raise that child to the best of your ability. And I don't even see that happen, because often the subtle excuses get used that sort of like avoid the very emotional spaces that lead to the very abandonment and neglect and pain situation that I'm describing in this podcast here. And it's very easy to then say, well, we did everything we could. But did you really? And that's something that doesn't get shared enough. And although sometimes, and this can shoot through to a Me Too movement and all kinds of issues, and that's not what we want either. There's a balance here, but it does need to be addressed. And that's why on Raw and Real, this is what I'm addressing next. I'm not going to avoid these situations because I'm part of that too, right? And so, but it stretches also beyond this to an issue that I have very much with healers, especially male healers, that I'm not picking on anybody specifically here, although I have someone in mind that I'm not going to share because it's not relevant for the podcast. But the point is that when you're a healer or a teacher or an instructor or someone that charges an exorbitant amount of money for your sessions, for your work, well, you better perform and deliver those results that you promise. Because otherwise, you're just a fraud to me. You're an imposter. And I see that painfully happen in this society, where people just take advantage in positions of authority, and that's positions of fake authority, not delivering on their promises, and then dumping responsibilities on people when they don't get the results that they actually deserve, that they've paid for. That happens a lot in the spiritual realm. Obviously, we know the examples to the level of where this happens when it becomes a physical, sexual dynamic, with the classic example of spiritual gurus and teachers taking advantage of people literally. But it also happens energetically at a much more subtle and vague level, when people are not intact, honest, and confront their own shortcomings. Because when you're that type of healer, you need to really to be authentic. As many will always say, we're all authentic, aren't we? We're all authentic until it comes to our own issues, and then we rather prefer to market what we'd like people to hear to keep our business. That's not authenticity. That's having an agenda to me. So again, let's slow down and let's take in some love here for ourselves and for those of you having gone through this pain of these experiences that have left you disappointed, maybe resentful, abandoned, at a loss, unsupported. Right? Yeah. So when you have that experience, what shows real character is when you can own up to your shortcomings, and you can put your overestimation of yourself into perspective, and you can be vulnerable and real with what you can and cannot do for others, because that may sound counterintuitive and to be avoided, and men are very good at avoiding this. It actually leads to more authenticity, but it also leads to more connection and more presence, connected to them, being connected to the moment, where from which is the place that you can actually deliver your best self to others, right? And that often requires an enormous taking of responsibility. No wonder that Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12-step program, people overcoming addictions, first step is take responsibility and ownership of your addiction. Because if you don't do that, you can't change either, right? And so this is the hard part, isn't it? That taking responsibility, and especially when the patterns that you're running and the experiences that you have on the basis of those patterns that you're in, right? When they're not even your fault, because it's not often our fault that these things happen, these abandonment situations, these triggers, these events. And the other party as well, right? It's not their fault, but it is their responsibility. And it is not your fault, and it is also your responsibility to own up to your side of the equation. This is where I've done a lot of relationship-based coaching and a lot of miscommunications, and I fall into this a lot, but I realize it. It's just, for me, there's a different, I see it, but I just don't want to own up to it because my ego doesn't want to. But it is about communication, and it is about ownership, and it is about taking that ownership. It's even more painful if you've taken that ownership, as I have done, for my own issues time and time again, and then you don't get received, and then you come back to the being unsupported and unseen in that place, and then all of a sudden you stop doing that, and then it is again fuel for the pain to take over, the negativity and all that, right? You don't want that, but it's hard. Life is really hard that way, right? And so the patterns that you're in may not be your fault. And things may happen, that many things that do happen are beyond your control, and or they have just happened to you, or they seem to happen to you again and again. Then responsibility, and this is the place where I really had a big issue, is like it can start to feel like an injustice. And I can't stand injustice, right? An unfair burden for you to own up to and to be responsible for. And then the ego gets in the way of not wanting to own up to those responsibilities. For example, one of the things that I had to own up with my girlfriend in the past is that I was owning up to the fact that actually the pain that we were constantly in was because I was using her as a crutch to react to on the basis of my pain. And there was no space left for anything positive to experience between us. That brought up a lot of grief. But it also helped heal some of the deeper sting of the pattern that she had with her father that never got resolved, that kept on repeating in the form of disappointments and letdowns and abandonments, and not being seen and acknowledged for who she was in her relationships. Right? How many people do that? So when I say the ego gets in the way, I don't really, let's define that, because I don't really mean, and this is maybe another takeaway, but the ego, I don't really mean like the word ego has so many negative associations to it, so that's not really helpful. Let's just put that aside for now. But To be nuanced, ego here, what I mean is having a strong identity, maybe of entitlement, or a strong identity at least of righteousness, which many men have too, but women as well sometimes, so that doesn't rule anyone out specifically. And it's holding on, doesn't want to let go, right? That's rooted in painful, maybe unfair life experiences and pain as a result of that, or a pain body cycle, right? It's sort of a collection of pain symptoms that just you don't overcome. And so that identity projects that blame outside of itself onto others, maybe out of anger and resentment and spite and all that. That is a problem, because then it's hard to own up to and take responsibility for your own actions when they constantly make you feel not good enough, unworthy. And when you've been approached or treated in a negative way for these issues, it becomes even harder, and you need more safety in order to come forward and actually heal these pieces. And where can you find that safety? Because to be honest, I don't see many places where you can, simply because many people have not walked so deeply that path. You need someone that has walked that path so deeply that they can actually hold the space and lean into these parts with you. Not avoid them, not neglect them, not pretend they're not there, because that's how it happened in the past when you were abandoned, not seen, disappointed, let alone, right? Not market their way around it or pretend to be better than it or further or at a higher level, which is spiritual bypassing or ego in a traditional sense of what I mean by ego. And it can go into taking advantage and all kinds of other stuff that we just discussed. But also simultaneously not to believe that what I'm saying now in this podcast, that those experiences, that if you're going through those, that they're invaluable or that they're negative or that they're not useful, which I often do that. I think, why do I share that on the podcast? Because it just feels like this is all negative. Who wants to hear this? But actually, you can use everything to heal and get stronger. And that's the key when you lean into it. And what I mean by leaning into this, and I will talk about this more on another podcast, is by digesting it through your very cleaned up present moment experience of being here and now with your presence. Just being here, fully, undivided. And that requires some cleanup to be able to do that for people. It requires being internally very coherent, because coherence is like a diamond that's shiny, is coherent internally, and that's why it shines. And that shine is why people like that, find it valuable, right? And pain, in the way that we're discussing in this podcast, for example, is just unpolished diamond. It's not worthless. It just needs to be brought back to its shine. And that shine is you, right? Take that in. Take a moment. Feel that deeper love. I know I often think it isn't there, but it is. And I know when you have this deep wound of disappointment based on abandonment and fear and all these struggles, it may really feel like it isn't there very often. So this is not an easy path, but this is the path. All roads lead to Rome, but Rome is like the saying, right? But it's the different road. It's how many different roads the more experienced you are, is how many different roads you've taken to get to Rome, so that you can reinforce the experience of how it feels to get to Rome. That's the key that makes you stronger and more connected to yourself and more present and more healed and more abundant and more happy. But it requires leaning into those experiences. And so often I see people and whole societies completely ignorant of what's really going on underneath the surface, which is actually, for me, not so much underneath the surface, but I understand that not everyone is so hypersensitive that they feel all of that. So, not to blame anyone, but it can't go on that way much longer. That's why things are surfacing right now in the world today, right? They need to. So I think this is a beautiful ending note here. I'm not going to make this today much longer than this. I think this is exactly what I wanted to bring through to you today in this podcast. Now, if you want support with this, because this is where the nuance comes in, that, as I shared in the beginning, is there isn't a part of the healing here that is required, that obviously you have to do things on your own, but there's also it's not good for marketing to share that, but again, raw and real, I don't care. But this is what it takes, and right, and there's also a part that you may need support with to be able to get stronger in being seen, being received, receiving that nourishing support, that acknowledgement, that recognition, but also that love, because it's also not true that those things are bad because they make you dependent because you need to do it all on your own. That's also not true. It really depends on the intent, and it depends on if it's the right thing in the right moment, and it depends on, if I look at myself, if you use the support in the right way to bring you further, or if you're using it as a crutch or a dependency to take you further away from yourself. It really depends on those two things. So if you're in the right space, you feel aligned, you need the support, you need to overcome certain wounds, you need to understand and build deeper connections, because it's all about building connections. Our neurology, our brain wiring is all about building connections, but it's also your experiences, your feelings. It's all about your feeling state connected to yourself. That determines whether you do something and from which place you do it and how you feel about it. That's the key here. That's the deepest underlying key to me. And if a healer can't help you with that, they're not helping you further, in my opinion. So, and in my experience. So if you need that contained safe space, right, which is hard enough to create, by the way, but if you need that, and to bring that allowance through, to get to that higher level presence, to move upward those energies, bring those forward of your true self, your real presence of radiance, eminence, right? Then I'm here for one-on-one support. There's also meditations that I've done that you can purchase and listen to in your own time. I don't have all the answers. In fact, as much as my ego hates it, it's a good thing I don't actually have all the answers, because it's much more, and I've had to learn this the hard way, but it's much more about holding spaces and being with spaces and sharing myself within spaces and bringing and containing and creating spaces than it is about having specific answers. It's more about what comes through within those spaces. And that's for you as well. Another takeaway here. Hopefully you're taking away a lot of good stuff. So with that, I want to end this podcast for today on Raw and Real. Thank you so much for being here, listening to me, taking this in, and hopefully this helps you build a stronger, more self-connected path for you to continue your life and move forward with. Until next time, bye-bye.